My name is Kyle from CircleCI, and we are talking about Hacktoberfest and our own special event called Orbtoberfest. I have Aaron here with me, who's going to be acting as moderator. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in chat, and we'll get to them at some point during the presentation. We're going to go over a little bit about what CircleCI Orbs are. We're going to go over a little bit about what Hacktoberfest is, how you can participate in Hacktoberfest, and at the end, we'll go over more about what CircleCI is for anyone who's newer to our product and what we do. So we're going to get started with a little slideshow, and then we'll move on to the rest of the things that we were just talking about. Let's get started. So I already introduced myself. My name is Kyle Tryon. I'm the community integration engineer here. So my job in particular, I work with Orbs almost exclusively. So if you are a company that wants to write an Orb, you'll most likely talk to me. Or if you're a user that's writing an Orb, you can definitely talk to me on our Discuss forum, and we can work together to make the best Orb possible. And let's do a quick, what is CircleCI for anyone who is here but not totally aware? CircleCI, we do CI/CD. And what that means is we react to changes in your code, and then we will act according to a configuration file that you specify and define within your code. So if you want to test your code on every commit, and then from there on, you can deploy to some other service or run a certain set of tests. It could be integration, it could be unit, it could be speed tests. So you can literally do anything. You define anything you want inside these config files, put it in your repo, and then every time you push code to CircleCI, we'll take that config file, read it, and act upon it. Orbs. Okay, so we were just talking about the config, and we're going to take a deeper look into config shortly. We'll show you exactly what that looks like. But when you're writing a CircleCI config, you have a YAML file. YAML, if you're not aware, it's kind of similar to JSON, but it's just a data configuration. So you can list out keys and values, and there's a few different types of values you can do, like maps and strings and so on and so forth. But these simple little YAML strings are what makes up your config. And it's common that you'll be doing the same thing across multiple projects. So let's say I constantly deploy to AWS, or I constantly deploy to Microsoft Azure, or so on and so forth. It would be not only annoying, but inefficient to have to write that in every single config that you have across your multiple projects in your organization. So what you can do is package them into what we call these CircleCI Orbs. And it's just like any other package manager. Like if you're familiar with Node.js and NPM, you can package scripts and then reuse them in multiple projects. This is the same concept. So you take a little bit of config, package it up, and then you can import it into other configs later on. And this is all version controlled with Semver, which is really great. And they're all open source. So if you write one, other people can use it. If we write one, you can use it, and so on and so forth. So here is a simple example of what a Orb YAML file might look like. And again, we're going to dig in a lot deeper, but we're going to go over kind of the short version first. But an Orb is made up mostly of commands, executors, and jobs. And on the left, we have an example of what each one of those things looks like. So let me start at the bottom for a moment. A job in CircleCI is a general task that you want to do. So if I have a job to run my tests against my code, what I'm saying is when I commit code to my GitHub or Bitbucket repository, I want to then automatically download that source code and then execute some command that will then run my tests. And then because we are a CI/CD company, what we generally do is then report back that information to GitHub or Bitbucket as a success or a failure. So any job will actually have a GitHub checks associated with it. So if you have a test job, in order to merge a PR, if you have branch protections enabled, that job will have to pass. And that's just one of many jobs you could do. Now, what a job is a collection of an executor and commands. So you have a job, you want to run tests, but you have to say, I want to run these tests, maybe it's NPM run tests, for example, and I want to run these tests in this environment. So I want to run it in Linux. Specifically, I want to run it in an Ubuntu Docker container with Node 10 installed, or something similar to those lines. So what you have here is commands, which define that you're going to be running something similar like npm run test, and executor, which says, I'm going to be running in a node-based Docker Linux environment. Or that could be a virtual machine, which could be Mac OS or Windows, or a regular Linux virtual machine. We're going to talk more about Orbs, but let's talk about Hacktoberfest, why we're all here. Hacktoberfest, every single year, for the last, I believe this is the 6th year, I hope I'm correct on that. For the last 6 years, DigitalOcean has been working with open source contributors so that we can all earn free cool swag for contributing to open source projects that benefit everyone. This year, DigitalOcean actually has a focus on climate change. So if you go to their website, you can just go to hacktoberfest.digitalocean.com. They'll show you some projects in the open source world that have some open issues that are related to climate change. And if you want to get involved with any type of open source project, those are some really good ones to get involved with. And what they're doing with this event is through the month of October, if you make 4 pull requests to any open source project in the world, of course, it does have to be on GitHub in this particular instance, they will get you a free Hacktoberfest t-shirt, which is really cool. It's unique every single year, and it's just really awesome collectible swag. CircleCI is joining Hacktoberfest for the first time this year, and we are calling it Orbtoberfest because we are focusing on our CircleCI Orbs, which are, of course, as we mentioned before, open source. So every single orb that exists is open source. If you contribute to an orb, you're automatically going to be entered into Hacktoberfest, assuming you've signed up for Hacktoberfest. And if you create a new orb, you will also be entered into Hacktoberfest just by the virtue of the fact that these all require pull requests to be performed in order to get through either contributing to an orb or creating your own. But on top of that, we're actually offering our own swag. I am ironically not actually wearing it at the moment. I apologize. But we have our own Orbtoberfest t-shirt, which you can get if you submit 4 pull requests to CircleCI Orbs. So if your 4 pull requests are to Orbs, you will not only get your Hacktoberfest t-shirt, you will also get a CircleCI Orbtoberfest t-shirt. And if you want to check out everything in detail, especially while we're going over this, you can go to hacktoberfest.circleci.com. That site as well is open source. We built that in Vue.js, so feel free to hack on that if you want to. Further down the page, you'll see some lists to events, like today is our October 10th virtual event. If you're in Seattle, Washington, or New York City, you can catch us on October 15th and 28th, respectively. Check out our best Orbs practices. You can search up the Orbtoberfest label on GitHub to find issues that have been labeled with Orbtoberfest. Any issue or any contribution to Orbs is going to count. These are just ways to help you find issues for things that people are already actively looking for participation in. So don't feel like you have to find one of those issues, but it's absolutely an option. If you're just looking for any orb, you can find it on our Orb Registry. We'll pull that up in a moment. Or you can just go on GitHub and search CircleCI-Orbs, and anyone who's actually given the topic to their GitHub repo, that will show up. Okay, so because I'm not wearing it, at least we do have a photo. So this is a photo of our Orbtoberfest t-shirt. This is what you'll get. If you create 4 PRs, you'll get the t-shirt. If you create 1 to 3 PRs, we are still giving out an Orbtoberfest sticker, which I'm really excited about. I do not personally have that one yet. I'm going to be getting it with the rest of you, just like you all. The only reason I have a t-shirt is because I want to show it off. On our Hacktoberfest page website, we also have this fun little thing because we wanted to basically have a project for Hacktoberfest. Go find our glowing crystal orb. And if you click on that, this again is built in Vue.js. If you click on that, it'll animate. We'll actually do one here. And it'll find you a random issue for you to get started with. And I think that is our last slide. So what we're going to do is do some hacking, some answering questions, and we're going to dive deeper into the CircleCI config, especially for people who are new to CircleCI and don't have the full grasp of what we're talking about here. That was just like a quick intro, but we'll dive a little deeper. But I want to take just a moment because I see that we have some movement in chat. So let's see what we got going on. All thanks for joining. Fantastic. All right, cool. So let's go take a look at, first of all, let's go look at our Hacktoberfest page. And then we will also take a look at some open issues. Go here and here. So this is the official DigitalOcean Hacktoberfest page website. If you are not already signed up, you should go over to hacktoberfest.digitalocean.com, click on Start Hacking. That'll get you signed up, and then any PR that you create will automatically be added to the Hacktoberfest event. Now that's DigitalOcean's event. That is separate from our event, and we'll get into that in just a moment. If you scroll down their page, you can find out the rules, but it's pretty much just create a PR. They do ask for, and we ask as well, there are some minimum quality standards. If you are going to contribute, please, make sure you're making a meaningful contribute. You know the word I'm looking for. Minor grammar error checking is totally fine. It's not the highest of quality contributions, but we'll absolutely take it. However, if you go in and add 1 period or 1 comma or something like that, there's a very high chance that your PR, not just by us, but across the board, would be labeled as invalid or just doesn't meet the threshold of a meaningful contribution. If you scroll down, you'll see a whole bunch of open source projects that you can contribute to. You can even filter it down by language. And again, just remember, this is all open source projects. This is not related to CircleCI's Orbtoberfest. This is just the overall Hacktoberfest event. And then, as we were saying before, you scroll down a little bit further, and you can find some projects focused on climate change. It looks like people have been actively contributing to these, because I believe this list used to be much longer. So it looks like there's only 3 on their homepage. Of course, you can click here to go find more. But let's go over to the CircleCI Orbtoberfest event now, which we're just doing on the side with DigitalOcean. Here we are. So here's our fun page. It's very, very similar concept. If you make 4 PRs, but this time not just to any open source project, it does have to be related to CircleCI Orbs, although it doesn't have to be one of our existing Orbs. You can make your own, contribute to your own Orb, or start a new one. And let's scroll down to what we were talking about. Here is our crystal orb that we talked about. If you're looking for any issues, you can just click here. The orb will spin, do its animation, and then you can find, here's one open issue. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. Uh-oh. All right, sorry, slow internet. Okay, so this was actually opened quite a while ago, although we added the label. So let's see, have we had any? We have a PR, but let's see what we have here. This is actually not one of our own orbs. This is under CodeCov. So like we said, anyone can create an orb, anyone can own an orb. So we won't be able to approve this PR or anything, but we can absolutely take a look at it. So the orb should allow the URL to be overridden for use with CodeCov Enterprise. So that wasn't, we'll take a look at the source to see more specifically what that meant, but we have a PR, so we can just see what that change looks like. And this will be an example of the type of small modification that you can make to an existing orb to get your own contribution into Hacktoberfest and get you those 2 awesome t-shirts. Because that's what this is all about. It's all about swag. So let's take our PR. And while GitHub is slowly loading, let's see. Found out about Hacktoberfest from Breaking Into Tech and Broke Squad at Career Karma. I want to help with making an app to encourage nature stewardship by rewarding people who pick up trash. This is cool. Ride bicycles or public transit, and other ways to do more with less materials, resources, as we are part of nature and we need to make better use of existing resources. Yeah, awesome. If you have a project currently, make sure it's tagged with that. I think this falls under climate change, even though it's not directly climate change. So make sure you're on the Hacktoberfest homepage with that tag. All you have to do is go open one of your issues and add the label climate change on it. So let's go take a look at this PR that we were looking at. So this is an example contribution. I haven't actually looked at this yet, so we're going to find out together if this is a good contribution and one that should be merged in. And even though this isn't our own orb, because we're here, we'll go ahead and make a comment on it and let the people at CodeCov know how we feel about it. So this was in reference to issue 19, which we just took a look at. And let's see what they have changed in their files. So let's take a look at what we got here. So this is our orb.yaml file. And that is the one file that has all the orb YAML source in it. And we can go take a look at our docs if we want to go in deeper, but just for the moment, let's see what changes were made. So the original description was modified, and I'm assuming, oh, they just removed a space, no big deal there. So let's see what they actually added. So here's the new URL parameter. Custom URL to submit to the CodeCov result, default to codecov.io/bash. And they were saying you need to be able to overwrite that because if you have enterprise, presumably you're hosting this on your own server somewhere. So originally it would only go here, but now that we've added our own parameter, we can overwrite this, and you can see down below that's exactly what they've done. This was hard-coded as codecov.io/bash. This line was removed, this line was added, and what we've done is we've substituted in that hard-coded URL for a parameter which already contains the default. So this is what we would call a minor change. It could even technically be considered a patch, but it is a new feature, so we're going to call it a minor change. This shouldn't affect anyone who's using the Orb currently if they were to not have the full Semver number scheme on it. So like if they're on version 3.2, for instance, and we make this change, it shouldn't affect anything for them. Nothing here has changed except for the fact that people on Enterprise will be able to substitute in their own URL in the case that they have to. So this looks perfect to me. Let's go ahead. We'll add a review, even though this is not our code, but let people know that it looks fantastic. I like to add GIFs because that brightens everyone's day. And just like that. So whoever this user is right here, minimal change. I think they changed like 3 lines. If you do that 4 times, you get 2 awesome t-shirts. It's really that simple. Let's go take a look while we have the extra time, while we have the people here. We're gonna go take a look at some of our Orb we're gonna look at our config resources as well as a sample config so that you can take a look at what the source looks like if you haven't actually seen one of these before. So let's go to our configuration reference. And I'll actually paste this in the chat as well. We should probably get some links going in the chat, although you can find everything you need on our Hacktoberfest website as well. This is the configuration reference for a CircleCI config. This is not Orb specific, although we have that as well. But I believe that in order to create a good Orb, you actually have to have a pretty good understanding of what a CircleCI config looks like natively. So we talked about jobs, commands, and executors. I want to show you how that lines up with one of our current configs and what that might look like as an end user. So let's take a look at what we have. This models our existing YAML schema. So you'll see as these items are indented, that's how they would appear in YAML as well. So you have these top level keys: version, orbs, commands, executors, jobs. That's mostly everything we've seen so far. If you have a config and you want to import your own Orb to use it, you'll do that with this Orbs key. Let's take a quick look here. So you'll start with the version key, which we already saw up above. Then you'll have your Orbs key, and then you can import an Orb. And this is very similar to, again, I'm going to use JavaScript because that's my preferred language. But if you're familiar with NPM, this is kind of like importing an NPM module. So you're saying, I want to import CircleCI/hello build at some version, and this is semvered. And you're going to import that into the hello space, right? And then further on below, in our workflow, we have defined, we have a job from that hello world, or this hello or orb, as we defined it right here. And that orb contains a job called hello build. Simple as that. The orb can contain commands, jobs, and executors. So this isn't evident right here what exactly hello build is, but it's being used in the context of a job. So it's actually possible that the hello orb has a hello build job. It's also possible that it has a hello build command. It could have both. It kind of depends on what context you're using it in, is how you'll call it. Let's take a look at a command. This is actually the heart of an orb. So when you want to perform any kind of task, you can encase it in a job. It will run in an executor, but the actual logic, everything that actually happens, that happens inside of a command. And it's not unusual for an orb to not actually have any jobs and just have commands. Although it is nice if you can package them into jobs in some cases, and we'll go over that in a moment. So let's say we have a command, and that's first of all going to be listed under our commands key, and that command is called say hello. We'll give that command a description, and this will actually show in the Orb registry. We have a totally self-documenting registry, so we'll show you that actually right up next. So if we want to know what is this say hello command, it's a very simple command for demonstration purposes. Cool. It has a few different parameters. Actually, in this case, it only has one parameter. Under the parameters key, we have one parameter called to. This parameter has a type of string, and the default value for that parameter is hello world. Now, this command is going to have a map of steps. In this particular command, it only has one step. So we'll look at our steps key. And under that, we have a single run statement. This is right here is technically a command as well. one run command echo, and then you'll see we have this double caret syntax for our parameters. Inside the double carets, we have parameters dot to. So you have the parameters key, and then the to subkey, which will have the value hello world. So if you should be clear, but if you were to run this in your config, you could obviously swap out hello world with anything you need in your particular config. That could be like an API key. That could be some arguments for a CLI command. It could be anything you need when it's run in this environment. And we already talked about, but we'll go over again, our executors. So in most situations, a lot of our users are going to be using Docker. So you'll see something like this. You'll have the executors key. You'll name your executors. So this one's just called my executor. This type of executor is a Docker executor, and it's using the CircleCI /Ruby and then a tag for the Docker image in this particular my executor. This might also be a virtual machine like we talked about earlier. It could be Mac OS, it could be Windows, it could be anything. Docker is going to be the most common. And jobs is how you marry the two together. You have commands, you have executors, but now you need to define, okay, I want to run these commands, I want to run them in this executor, and I want to run them when and how. That's going to be done through your jobs and then workflows, which we'll go over again in just a moment. So let's see if we have an example job. Here we go. Under our jobs key, we have one job named build. And this is not using a custom executor. Notice that there is no executor key in this example. We just have Docker image. So in this particular example, it's not actually using an orb in this job. This is just a standard vanilla job. And that means, let's just say that here's a perfect example of why you'd want to use an orb. Let's say you have 5 projects on CircleCI that all use the same Docker image. They all use the same tag. And for some reason, you need to update all 5 of those at the same time. Rather than going into each individual project, if you were to use an orb and that orb had an executor that was defined or parameterized, you could use that executor instead, update your orb, make whatever change you want, and then that update could propagate to all your projects. So this is an example of why you might not want to have the Docker key directly in there and why you could use an executor. There are a few other keys that go along with a job that I'm not going to go too deep into right now, but we have features such as parallelism, which is used for test splitting. So you could have one container actually run 10 times and run a subset of tests on each parallel container so that they all happen relatively much faster. Obviously, the number of containers you have will dictate that. Resource class, if you're on our new pricing plan, you can control how much memory and CPU is in your job. So it's very common to, especially in an orb, if you have a small task, like something that's just running a reporting job or something that's just curling a request, you don't actually have to spin up the normal 4 gigabytes of RAM used and 2 CPU, because that's going to use more credits than is necessary. So we can actually lower a resource class to something like small, or in this example, let's say we're working on a large project, maybe something with Android and we need a lot of memory, we'll give ourselves the large resource class. And what you give yourself is going to be very dependent on the job that you are trying to tackle. So if you are developing an orb that pings Slack, for instance, we have the Slack orb, there's no reason to use the large resource class. But if you have an orb that compiles some kind of binary, there's a very good chance that you might need something like that. Working directory just maps to what folder inside the container you're going to start in. And we're going to skip over branches and we'll just run right down to steps. So steps are actually, it's very much, you'll notice it's extremely similar to what we saw in commands. So in a job, you can run a list of steps. The step is exactly what we saw in commands. You can run whatever command against the shell that you're currently running in that you want. So here we're running make test. That could be echo this, hello world that. But if you have defined any custom commands in your orb, you can also call them here. So instead of running run, you could say greeting or whatever it is that you've defined. So let's go take a look at the Orb Registry, which we were talking about a moment ago, the self-documenting orbs, and then an example of what like a real orb looks like. And we'll probably take a look at, let's take a look at the AWS serverless orbs. So let's go to the Orb Registry first. Page, but let's just start at the home page real quick. All right, so on the homepage of the Orb Registry, this is where you're going to find all of our existing orbs. By default, there's a filter that limits it to certified and partner. These are, the certified orbs are ones that we at CircleCI have written. Partners are people that we have worked with and have vetted their orb, and we have a relationship with them to keep ongoing maintenance. And then if you're writing your own orb, you will find it under the All tab. So let's take a look at AWS Serverless right here. Everything you see on this page right now is completely dynamically generated from the source of the orb. So every time you publish a new version of your orb, again, I'll harp back to like JavaScript. If you're running npm publish, it just how it would update on the npm registry, it's the same here. So everything you see, this description comes from the orb source. The orb quick start guide is something that we kind of inject in there automatically. Every orb is going to make sure, you need to make sure that your CircleCI config is on version 2.1 at least. So we'll let the user know, hey, make sure your config has 2.1, not 2.0 or something lower. And in order to import the orb, exactly as we spoke about before, you can name it whatever you want, but this orb lives under the CircleCI namespace and is named AWS-serverless. And the current version is 1.0.1, subject to change. If you were to put this in your own project, you might do 1.0 so that you can get all your patch updates. And in this example, we obviously called it AWS Serverless. Maybe you just want to call it serverless. It's a little bit shorter, whatever you want to do. Usage examples. So this is actually one of the keys of an orb. We talked about commands, executors, and jobs. Those are the main keys. There is actually some additional keys, and usage examples is one of them. And the sole purpose of that key is actually just for documentation purposes. It does not add any extra functionality to the orb, but it will help users know how to use your orb. It's kind of like when you have a GitHub repo and you have the README file. That README file is not necessarily part of the project itself, but it is part of what you need to look at if you are to contribute. So let's see what we have. This is slightly out of order. I apologize. The order doesn't actually matter, but it's for how we're going to look at it. Let's import our orbs. We have AWS Serverless. It's the only one we're importing in this example. We're going to define a job. This is one custom job, and I'll go over what's happening here in just a moment. But this is my test my API job. It's going to run in the Executor AWS Serverless default. We can take a look at what this actually is in just a moment. And what's going to happen in this test my API job is we're going to run some kind of testing framework. So in this particular example, with AWS Serverless, for anyone who's not aware, what you would do is you would spin up some kind of API on Amazon AWS, and it would give you a path which you could then run any type of API testing suite against. So in this particular example, we're just saying run your tests here because you could import another orb that does API testing. You could run your own API tests. You might have some kind of suite or maybe some kind of custom run program, whatever you want to do. So define your job here for actually testing that API. Now let's take a look at our workflow. We haven't actually talked about workflows yet. Probably should have a little while ago, but workflows are how we instruct our pipeline what jobs to run when. So this entire config, what is this, 24 lines, is actually enough to tell us that we want to spin up a serverless environment in a serverless app in a staging environment. We then want to test that serverless application. And then if those tests pass, we want to deploy that same serverless application to a production environment. So let's take a look at how that happens. We take a look at our workflow. We have our test and deploy workflow. And we define what our jobs are in that workflow. We have the first one, AWS serverless / deploy. And we'll take a look at a moment. We can see on the left side, we have jobs and deploy right here. So we'll see exactly what's going on. But that takes in some parameters. So the name, deploy staging, the stack name, that's actually something on AWS's side. And we'll call this the staging stack. And the location to the template file. If you're using AWS serverless SAM is what they call it, the serverless application model, you have to have a template file. So this is AWS specific, but just to show you how it works in an orb. The next job in the workflow is the test my API. And you can see that this requires that deploy staging runs first. So if deploy staging runs and does not fail, if it does fail, the pipeline ends right there. If it does not fail, then test my API will continue to run after this job has finished. So now we have our API up in our staging environment. Now we're running our test against that API, and that again will pass or fail. And if it fails, then that ends the pipeline, and you would see on GitHub when you're trying to make some kind of merge or something like that, that the GitHub checks would show you tests have failed. Now let's assume the tests have passed. We'll go on to the third job, and that's AWS serverless deploy again. So this is the same code. We're not duplicating a job. We're just importing the orb, which already has a defined job, and we're importing it twice. But what we're doing is we're going to change the parameters. So instead of deploy staging, we're going to name this one deploy production for obvious reasons. It requires that the test my API job has completed. And what it's going to do is deploy to the stack name of production stack. Obviously different from our staging stack. What we'll have done is verify that everything works in staging with our tests, and then we'll deploy it to production. And that's how you can, let's take a look at how much code we actually saved. So if we take a look at our jobs, this is the definition for the job that we have defined in our orb. And I'll toggle this in just a moment so we can see the source. But what we'll have is a description, so it deploys serverless applications, and every parameter that is acceptable for this particular job. So AWS has some specific things, such as AWS region, which in this case is taking an environment variable as the default value. So it's expecting that you have an environment variable called AWS _ default _ region. We can see that that is defined as an envar name type. And that what that does is it'll take any string, but that string has to be POSIX compliant in order to be considered valid. And this is just something that can kind of help with protecting secrets, webhooks, passwords, anything like that. Store them in an environment variable, a secret manager, context, whatever you need to do, but then we'll get them into the orb through an environment variable. Some of these will have defaults, which means that there's nothing that you need to fill in. Some of them will be given a default value that is empty. That just means that it's not required. Some may be required. So let's take a look at this, right? In order to deploy, you must provide the S3 bucket that you're going to deploy to. So the way that we've done that is there is no default value. It's expecting a string, but there is nothing given. It's not an empty string. It's just literally nothing, which means that this is a required parameter. So if you do not provide that, there will be an error that is reported back to you. And that is pretty much how that works. Let's take a look at the source so we can actually get an idea of what happened under the scenes. What did that deploy job actually do? So we have our description right here with the description key. It's exactly what you see right here because it is self-documenting. The list of parameters and their descriptions, which we just went through. So we'll skip past all this. And here we go. We get to the steps. So these are the actual steps that are executed in this particular job. One thing we did skip over, actually. Did we do the executor? OK, so we did skip over the executor. So all the steps that we're looking at run in this default execution environment. And I'll show you exactly what that is after we take a look at the steps. So the first step to run is checkout. That's a custom built-in step from CircleCI. And what that does is it goes and downloads your source code, puts it onto the current environment. This is exactly the same as an orb command. This is just kind of an orb that is built into CircleCI. You can think of it like that. So we have this checkout command given to you. The next command that's run is install. Now, install is not built into CircleCI. That is not something that is part of the config in CircleCI. Where that comes from is the command right here. You can see commands. We have build, deploy, install, and local start API. These commands are further abstraction. So we can use these commands in our own jobs, and we can also use them in the jobs that are defined in the orb itself. And it just really reduces on duplication. So we're going to install, going to pass that in a parameter. We have another command called build, which again is over here. So we're not even seeing the full length of the code here. This is still much shorter than, I think we said 24 lines is what the user ends up writing. That gets passed in a whole bunch of parameters, you know, where your S3 bucket is, the template, everything we looked at, and then a similar situation for deploy. And one kind of fancy thing about this is we also have, you can see in between build and deploy, we have another steps key, and this takes in a parameter of pre-deploy. Let's see what this is real quick. I know what it is, but let's take a look. Pre-deploy. Run these, oh, there's actually a spelling mistake here. So if anyone wants to go get one of their PRs, right there. Run these steps prior to deploying the application, but after the checkout, install, build, and package steps. So this actually takes in, as a type, steps. So if there's something, you can define this deploy job, and a user can just drop it into their config. But if they want to interact with it a little bit more fine-grained, like they want to go a little bit deeper into it. Of course, they could write their own job. They can define their own job, put in the executor, write their own steps, whatever they need to do. But what you're giving them the opportunity to do is drop in just this one deploy job, and then if there's some extra stuff that needs to happen in between deploying and building, they can inject those steps right into the job through here. All right, so let's go back to our source real quick. I think we went over everything here. Perfect, yeah. But what we're not seeing is we don't see the install command, the build command, and the deploy command. So even this is shorter than what we're talking about. So let's just take a quick look at what that looks like. Install, scroll down to our steps. So in order to use anything with AWS, you have to have the AWS CLI installed. So one of the first things this is going to do is make sure that Python is installed, because AWS CLI is installed with pip. This is actually handled in the AWS CLI now. That orb has been updated, so this is actually no longer necessary just because the AWS CLI handles that itself. This can be removed as long as the AWS CLI orb is updated. And you can see that we're going to have to go, let's go to the full source. So at the bottom of the page, you can see the full source rather than each individual component. And the reason I want to go here was just to show, here we go, that even this orb itself has imported another orb. So this is the AWS serverless orb, but it's actually also relying on this AWS CLI orb, which has been imported from CircleCI /AWS CLI, imported as AWS CLI. So let's go back to that install command. And we can see after it checks for Python, it's running AWS CLI install. So that'll automatically install the AWS CLI for us, further reducing the amount of code we need to write. So I don't know how many lines we would be at currently if we were to actually expand this all out. We can find out if we run it, but we're at, just this command alone is 80 lines. The orb source itself is 437 lines. And that's not even the full source, because the AWS CLI is a separate orb that's imported in there. And all that is allowing you to do what we see here, which is that whole deploy to AWS, test, move to production, and we're doing it in 24 lines. Maybe a little bit more because your actual tests would be longer here, but that's generally the gist of it. So I'm glad we were able to get through most of that in a reasonable amount of time. I'm gonna take some time now. I wanna go over some questions. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of stuff that, excuse me, that maybe we haven't gone over. I'm assuming the majority of the people that are in this call are at least somewhat familiar with CircleCI and the basics of CircleCI. So I'm happy to answer any questions from total beginner to pro if you have any questions about orbs. And we can even take a look at some existing PRs. Maybe we'll actually submit a live PR if we still have enough people on the line, which it looks like we do. So let's take a look at what kind of questions we have right now. I see we have one. Will I be able to build and sign? Oh, go ahead.
No worries, I was just helping you out there. Will I be able to build and sign Mac Electron app using Orbs is our first question.
Yeah, so I'm going to start off by saying that I am not a Mac OS expert. That is probably where I know the least amount of information. But I will say that, yeah, first of all, we have tons of users on Mac OS that are signing applications, especially on Electron. And in fact, I'll try and pull it up at the same time. I believe we have what we have is a React Native sample project, which builds on Mac OS and does sign. So anything you do on CircleCI normally, you can of course do in an orb. It's just packaging that same config. So if we were to go take a look at the CircleCI React Native, let's see what we get. I believe this, nope, not that. This right here, third link. Third link's the charm. And let's go take a look at what their config file looks like. Now this is a fairly old project, but we should be able to see that, let's see what we have here. We have several jobs. One is called the Node job. One is called the Android job. And I'm assuming, here we go, we have one called the iOS job, which is building under, we saw before we were talking about Docker. So this one is actually building on Mac OS. This is a little bit older, so it's on Xcode 9. A working directory was set, yada, yada, yada. Let's continue through. And again, not being a Mac person, I am not totally sure what we're looking for. Here we go, bundle exec Fastlane. Oh, right, so through Fastlane, you can do code signing. That's probably going to be your most common way of doing this. So if you were to build, let's say, a Mac OS orb in general, what you might want to do is start with, you can say, okay, so maybe I know that I'm always going to have a gem file lock or a gemfile.lock that I want to use for my caching. And I know that I'm going to obviously be building in Mac OS under some version of Xcode. And maybe we want to know, is Ruby installed? Is something like that installed? So all of these lines in between here could be packaged into a single orb. So you could have a job that has an executor that just is Mac OS with whatever version of Xcode you need. That could be a parameter as well. And then you could just have a command called maybe something like sign or just Fastlane or whatever you want. And what that'll do is just literally run this step here. That might not be the best example in the world because there's not a lot here that is parameterizable, and it's a fairly short and simple command to run. But that would be the general idea behind it. If it was a much longer piece of code, it might make a lot more sense. But if you do add in the automatic caching, you could save the user a lot of time here. If you know that you're going to be using Yarn, if you know you're going to be using gem files, then you don't necessarily have to write it all out. That's definitely something that could be handled by an orb. All right, let's take a look at some examples of some open PR or some open issues that exist right now. And I think we can probably make a contribution, more than likely. We're going to do it live, so let's see if we can actually find anything that we can do and anything that will be simple enough. So we have our crystal ball. Feel free to click on that, and then below that is just a list of some random issues, and below that you can actually get the full list, which lives on GitHub. I'll actually post this in the chat as well. Okay, I'm going to avoid Slack at the moment only because we have quite a few PRs open on that, and that will take further research than what we're doing here. Wow, we have a lot of Slack Orb stuff. AWS ECS could take on that one, although I'm not the most experienced with that. So let's just keep looking just out of curiosity. Okay, this is one that would also be easy. Not someone we're going to do on stream here, but if we have a CircleCI Orbs directory, which actually has multiple orbs in it, and that we're trying to break up into multiple repositories, that would be a fairly easy one to get at. Step report success, even if it alerts fail. Let's see what this is. This is a Slack orb, which I said we were going to avoid, but let's see what issue we're dealing with. Sorry, just going back to one of our questions. The only issues that give points to Hacktoberfest are tagged, or we can make any PR. So two different events, but very similar for both. For Hacktoberfest, in order, any PR at all, doesn't matter what it is, if it's a PR, you are automatically going to be part of Hacktoberfest, but you do have to go sign up at Hacktoberfest website. That's the hacktoberfest.digitalocean.com. Once you've signed up there, it will automatically track any PR you make to any, it could even be your own repository. However, that would be, violating the spirit of Hacktoberfest. We are trying to, build up open source projects, but any PR will be fine. Now for CircleCI, and I don't think I made this clear before, so I do want to go over it again real quick. Hacktoberfest.circleci.com. We do not have, it is not any pull request to get the Orbtoberfest shirt. The rules for our event is only orb related. So you have to open a PR to an existing orb or create a new orb. And then when you're done, there is a Google form that you need to fill out. There's a button on our hacktoberfest.circleci. You can click it right here. There's also another smaller link right here. So check out the issues that are here. It doesn't have to be one of these. There are these that are labeled with Orbtoberfest to make it easier to find them. But as long as it is in Orb, feel free to make a contribution, send it in, and we'll absolutely take a look at it. All right, let's see what we got. So when was this opened? January 3rd. It's a little older. Let's just make sure this is still relevant. Okay, cool. So actually looks like someone already submitted a PR. So we're just going to take a look and review it. So what was the original ask? step reports success even if it alerts fails. Okay, so I see. So curl was not found in the container. It says the job failed and the alert was sent, but you can see this green bar right here. What it's saying is in CircleCI, even though it failed, what's happening is the step actually came back green. However, that would technically be accurate. Let's just see what the rest of the comments say. Right, so as we said, the Docker image does not have curl. And okay, so what we want to do is, if the image that we're dealing with does not have curl installed, we want to exit early because we want to let the user know that this orb only works if curl is installed on the environment that it's being ran in. So quick side note, sort of, if we were to define our own orb and we create a job and that job has an executor, that executor can be anything we want and it would most certainly have curl installed. However, this user is trying to make use of a command. And the command can be run in any execution environment that is defined by that user. So they could even be trying to run it on Mac OS. They could be trying to run it on Windows. They could be trying to run it on any version of Linux in whatever Docker container. It's written in a way so that it's expected to be running in Bash. If it is running in an environment that it doesn't expect, there could be some side effects that we hadn't really considered. So this being one of these side effects in this particular example is that if curl is not included, the orb will fail. And there aren't a ton of images out there. It's not the default that most images will not have curl installed. However, we see this in images with like Alpine or something like that. Rather than try to get around it by installing curl or doing something silly like that, because we don't know what environment they're in, we just want to let them know, hey, if you want to use this orb, that's totally fine, but you must have curl installed. And then our hope would be that they would then update whatever Docker image they're using, whatever environment they're using to include curl. So we do have someone who has taken a look at this. And actually, I think there is some history in this. We have some stuff we want to change. Let's see what it's looking like. Okay, so using the which utility checks if curl exists. If it does, then the code is returned as 0. Otherwise, we return 1. So that makes sense. Let's take a look at the files that were changed. So we have the which curl command, which is then pushed into this curl exists environment variable. And we're gonna echo that out, and we're going to see if it's 1 or if it's 0 is what it looks like here. So if it returns a 1, the which curl command, that's an exit code of 1, meaning there was an error. If it doesn't exist, then echo curl not installed. Otherwise, if it returns 0, meaning that it does exist, then we can just continue on. Let's see what we have here. And then they're removing at the end, I forgot to mention, they're also removing that environment variable they created. Not really necessary, but nice to clean up any messes you create. So this might be good to, were we waiting for something? I think that we were waiting for files to be changed, but everything looks fine here. Looks as if once this change is added, and this looks better. Oh, okay, so someone had suggested cleaner code. This looks quite clean to me. Take just another look at it. They're going to use this in, so what we were looking at up here, this is the, if you take a look at the structure for this code, this is in the source folder, commands folder, approval.yaml. Let's do a slight side conversation. We talked about the orb.yaml file earlier. In some of our larger orbs, what we like to do is we call this deconstruction. So we have a single @orb.yaml file. And this is a standard convention. The @ symbol says that this is a partial file. And what it's doing is it's acting as the main point. What we want to do is take all of the other files in this directory, and we want to import it into this @orb.yaml file. This is a really nice structure when you have an orb that has a lot of commands or anything. It also makes it really easy for open source contributors to take part, because then they can focus on individual pieces rather than one large mega file. So if we look at our @orb.yaml file, all this will contain is the description of the orb, and it also include any other orbs that we import into this orb, although the Slack orb is solely based on curl, so it doesn't need any other orbs installed. And then we'll have one folder for every top level key. So we have the commands key, the examples key, the executors key, and the jobs key. Inside there is where we'll have each item under that key. So let's take a look at jobs. And we have the approval-notification.yaml. Go in there, and that will have the description. And it's exactly the same as having a giant orb.yaml file. But what we can do is run in our CLI tool, CircleCI config pack. And that will take everything in that folder and make it one single orb.yaml file. So let's go back to what we were looking at. So what they're doing is adding this check to every single command. So we have the approval.yaml command. And if they try to run that, of course, we need to find out if curl is installed. But that will also be true of the notify.yaml command and the status.yaml command. I think, is that the last? Yes, and that's the last one. So if we want to make sure that this is a valid contribution, it actually looks fine to me. I think we were looking for one change, but it's really not necessary. This one line looks good to me. Provide an error if curl is not installed, and that's on status, notify, and approval. Let's just double check it and make sure that is all the commands. I feel like we might have more commands than that. Slack orb. I like to actually take a look at the Orb Registry. We could take a look at the code itself, but I like reading the documentation. Oh, where am I going? Orb Registry. Go back here. All right, and let's see what we have. So we have approval, notify, notify on failure, which I think is actually new. It probably was, I think it was added after that PR was created, and status. So just to verify here, we have approval, notify, status, but we are missing notify on failure. Handy command to notify a Slack channel on failure in the default master branch. I think this is actually an older command in general because we have this status command, which you can pass fail only to. So one of the pluses and minuses of open source for sure is we have a lot of contributions from a lot of people and over a long period of time. So I don't know if I necessarily agree that this needs to continue to exist, but I don't want to remove it yet. It's definitely something we can open up to the community and see how they feel about it. One very nice thing about Orbs, though, is because they are semvered and immutable, if we were to remove this notify on failure feature, it would, first of all, we would go from 3.4 to 3.5, and any user who is on 3.4 or below would not be affected by that change. So fantastic. One of the changes I would definitely like to see made soon is at one of our executors we have is Alpine. We actually prefer to have now, we have our Orbs best practices published, which was published far after the Slack orb was created. And we prefer that every orb has a default executor now, just as a standard naming convention. You could, of course, have then additional executors, but we like to have one single default executor. So I think that we should accept this. I am considering asking them to add it to the missing command, but we could also open that as a new PR as basically essentially a bug. So let's go ahead. I think we're going to take this. We'll review the change. And I will add, right now we're not showing the best of practices because we're in the middle of making a large change. No one has asked yet, but I assume it will come up for anyone who's interested in creating orbs. How do you test an orb? So there is no single right answer to how to test an orb. We have a few different philosophies going on. The Slack orb is definitely using one of the older philosophies, which makes it a little bit difficult to test when we're talking about open source contributions. The best type of testing you can do is to publish a development version of your orb, not a production version, and then run it inside of some type of sample config, a sample project on CircleCI that will put it through its paces and tell you whether or not that orb has broken in, whether or not your change has broken anything. It's like smoke tests or integration tests. How you specifically do that is currently up to. We are going to be releasing an automated pipeline through our Orb starter kit, which I should also go over. However, the Orb starter kit is currently in beta, so I do encourage you to use it, as I believe it will make creating new orbs much easier. However, it definitely could use some improvements, and will be definitely receiving some improvements in the upcoming months, especially after what we've been learning through this whole process. So if you were interested in creating an orb, the Orb starter kit is by far the easiest way to get started at the moment. You can clone or download this project. I'll put this in the chat as well. And what you can do with this is we have this orb-init.sh file. That's just a simple bash script. And what it will do is it will take you through everything that you need to do in order to create a new orb, as well as get you started with an Hello World orb. It will create a new GitHub repository and follow the project on CircleCI, as well as add a private key between the project and GitHub, so that this project can automatically publish new versions of orbs if need be. In the future, we're going to do that through the API, but that is how that works currently. And then what you'll end up with, I'll show you right now in the source folder, you'll have a clone of this as your current orb, and then you can just make changes to it, push them to GitHub, and it will automatically publish new development versions of the orb. What you'll be given is this Hello World structure. So it automatically comes destructured into the separate folders as we talked about. And every time you push a change to your code, what it'll do is automatically pack this down into one file and validate it for you. You will have to write your own tests, as that's not something we can really infer. And if you are looking for just a really good getting started point, this is also a Hello World orb. So you'll have it if you clone this, or if you just want to take a look at some code, you can take a look here. I'm just going to go look at it real quick, and then I think we'll take a look at some last questions. So in commands, we have our greet.yaml. And this will show you just a simple example of a custom command. We've pretty much already looked at this, but put in your description, your parameters. So this will take in a greeting parameter of a type string. The default is hello. And if we run this hello world statement, we can echo what our greeting is, world. So this would finally come out to be hello world. Go back to our source real quick. Take a look at our executors. We have our default executor, which will have a description at the top. What the executor actually is, in this case, it's Docker, and it's taking in an image, in this case, CircleCI node. It also has a parameter for the tag. So currently, it's going to be automatically going to the latest tag. However, if the user was to provide something else, they could add that in as a parameter. And if we put those two things together, we can take a look at a job. And we have our hello job, which will take in the default executor, which will, this is what's called a pass-through parameter. Because our executor and our command take parameters, we want to make sure that this job also has that parameter so that we can pass it through. So we know that our greet command has a greeting parameter, and if we want to be able to pass that through in this job, we have to make sure that we add that to our job. So we have this greeting parameter, which is exactly the same, and then we can run our custom greet command with the greeting of most likely hello, as it is our default. And then you can just pass it into your workflow as a simple job. And that is pretty much it. So let's take a look at some of our questions, and then if anyone wants to follow up or link to any orbs that they have specific coding questions on, we can definitely take a look at that. Let's see. Is there a reason I can't see anything that is getting posted to chat? Probably. Let's see why. Oh, yes, I see why. All right, so I will make sure that we get our links there. In fact, I apologize for that. Here we go. So looks like I'm gonna have to PM that to you. It looks like if Aaron, if you're available, Aaron, the links that I've posted to the chat, they are going to all panelists. If we could copy those out to the users, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. I'll get on that.
As for the last one here, hey Kyle, do you mean the Zoom? Okay, this is related to our first question. So we should have that resolved for you momentarily. And I think we have over here as well. Do orbs support GitHub Actions? Yes-ish. The reason I'm saying yes-ish is because they're not, I'm having a hard time answering this question. It's not like a direct relationship, right? So what I mean by that is, you can trigger anything with a GitHub action, right? So if you trigger, it's hard to say because it could be anything. If you trigger any type of event with a GitHub action that results in a CircleCI job being performed, then that job can contain an orb. So like, for instance, let's say you're using GitHub actions to trigger an API call to CircleCI. So let's say you're using our new API to say, I want to run this job on CircleCI based on this GitHub action for whatever reason. The orb does not interact with GitHub actions directly, but you can then use GitHub actions to trigger a job on CircleCI, which uses an orb. And you can actually, let me pull this up as well. I'm not even sure, maybe I won't pull it up. I'll just tell you about it because I don't think it's actually released yet. But the documentation is on GitHub, so it's public but not public. We have our new 2.0 API with pipeline parameters, which allows you to, all of these parameters that we're talking about, like for instance, default hello, stuff like that, you can pass in through an API call. So I could imagine that you could probably find an interesting reason to use GitHub Actions to build up that API call in a dynamic way, which would then trigger some type of dynamic job on CircleCI. There's a lot you can do here, and we're talking about basically an infinite amount of logic, because you can build not only in Bash, you can build in any other language. In fact, if y'all don't mind, I still have some of you here. So let me pull up our best practices, as well as our frequently asked questions. I feel like we'll probably get over some of this. And look at this, we actually had someone already made a pull request to fix that typo. You know what, I'll pull that up in a moment and we'll actually approve that. Well, let's take a look at our best practices and our FAQ, and then we'll do that. So let's make sure that this gets into chat. Do this, all panelists and attendees. There we go. So now everyone should be able to see that link. I apologize for the links prior to that. This is our best practices guide. If you have any general questions, you should most likely be able to find it here. If you don't, please let me know or open up an issue on GitHub, because I would love to fix that. If you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you can click on suggest an edit to this page. So if you find something confusing here, that first of all wouldn't surprise me. Feel free to let me know. Awesome. Everything here you should find pretty useful. This is, for instance, very similar to what we were talking about when we were talking about the AWS CLI. So if your orb, for instance, requires that a certain environment variable is present in order to work, it would be a good idea for you to actually code in some kind of logic that says, make sure that this exists. If it doesn't exist, we should fail gracefully, which is echoing out this error and then exiting with 1. So this will be your high level best practices, what should it look like, kind of information, and then we'll take a look at our Orb author FAQ. So this, kind of a sister document, but one of the things I really wanted to go into was to show you, one of the common questions is what programming languages are supported. And we did kind of go over this, but just to go a little bit deeper into that. What language do I use to write an orb? Well, specifically, you are using a CircleCI YAML config language, which is just standard YAML with some extra bits added to it, which you've seen from our configuration reference, which I think the link is already in there, but I'm going to paste it again. Oh, except I didn't give you the link. I gave you the text. Copy link address. So anything you can find in the configuration reference is valid CircleCI config. Of course, you can also use our CLI to validate any type of config that you write. But specifically, how do you write logic for your orb? Well, there's a lot of ways you can do that, but we highly recommend Bash. The reason we recommend Bash is because not only is that the default shell environment, it is what you're going to find in the vast majority of builds that take place in CircleCI at the moment. As Windows starts to pick up, we might have to differentiate between like a Windows version orb or a Bash version orb, or we'll do some kind of like smart detecting beforehand. But let's take a look at what this actually looks like. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to show you, for instance, if you didn't want to use Bash and you did want to use, for example, Python. Now, I would want to tell you, please don't use Python unless you absolutely have to. Or in some situations, it just makes obvious sense that Python is going to be installed for your orb to work in the first place. For instance, if I'll use the AWS CLI again, it does not work without Python, which means that there would be no situation where a user would use that orb unless Python was installed on the machine. So it's perfectly reasonable to say that Python is a dependency of your orb. So let's say, fine, I know that we're going to be using Python. There's no chance that we're not going to be using Python. So how do we do that? And by the way, if this is your own orb for your own project and no one else is going to use it or care, do whatever you want. It's totally up to you. So there would be no reason not to use Python if it's just meant for you and you are always going to be using Python. The reason we say to use Bash is just so that it's more useful to a larger group of people. Depends on what your objective is. So by default, the run statement will actually point to Bash, as we were talking about, but you can specify a shell. So for instance, if we pointed at the Python 3 binary, rather than writing Bash inner commands, we can actually just write Python right to the Python interpreter. Or very similarly, and this one we're going down of, like Bash is our most recommended, Python is not recommended, binary is super not recommended, but absolutely impossible to get around in a lot of situations. So if we have some kind of executable that needs to be ran, what we can do is you have a few options. If you can write the source code, like let's pretend it's Python, directly into the orb, you should absolutely do that for a few reasons. One of the most obvious reasons being that it's actually baked into the source. It's not something that the user then has to go fetch over the internet. Anytime you have to go fetch over the internet, what you're doing is opening yourself to the possibility of a new type of failure. Let's say like maybe GitHub is offline, maybe there's just a networking glitch. For some reason, it's going to cause it to fail, but it's not of the reason of the orb. It's just because it went to go download something. So if you can avoid downloading something, absolutely go for it. But in a lot of situations, that's just not an option. For instance, in the AWS serverless orb that we were looking at earlier, it's actually required that we use Linux Homebrew. So if you are not using a Docker container that has Homebrew already installed, that's something that we absolutely must install in order to get that CLI installed. And of course, you're going to do the same with any other CLI. If you're using pip install, if you're using apt-get, if you're importing a binary in any way, sometimes you can't get around it, and it's just necessary in order to do what you have to do. We just try to avoid that whenever we can. And I did say we're going to go take a look at the serverless typo since we're here, and we have it, and I really do appreciate that. Thank you. Fix the typo in the description of deploy.yaml. Let's take a look at the file changed, and this is in the serverless orb. Cool, it's exactly what we were talking about. Thank you so much. Let's do and approve. Perfect. Maybe. Come on, GitHub. There we go. Squash and merge. I'll show you too. One thing. Oh, not enabled for this repository. Why is this? Do I not have access? There we go. One thing that we are going to be implementing. This is a sneak peek. We're not there yet. It will be happening soon. But we talked about how are you going to test orbs? How are you going to automatically deploy orbs and things like that? Well, we are working on an automated pipeline, like a version 2 past that orb starter kit, which has its own, but we're working on another one. And the way we're going to do that is every change, we're going to actually put in the commit message. So since this is a typo, this would technically be a patch. Some people wouldn't even call it a patch. We would just skip it, but I'll call it a patch. So we're going to call this semver patch. At the moment, this doesn't do anything at all. But in the near future, when we finalize our pipeline, we'll have a new CircleCI config that will be automatically generated in our Orb starter kit. And then that will take this semver patch and say, okay, this was merged in, it passed our test, yada, yada, and we know it's a patch. So from going whatever version is out there now will automatically update based on this. Not a thing yet, but we're getting into the habit of putting this in here. Let's go ahead and merge that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We'll take any final questions, and that is pretty much it. I hope everyone joins in the fun. I would say go check out our Discuss forum if you have any follow-up questions or anything like that. Make sure you register on hacktoberfest.digitalocean.com to make sure you get the official Hacktoberfest shirt. If you want to participate in Orbtoberfest, make sure that you make your PRs to Orbs, and then you actually have to go submit our Google Forms. So you go to hacktoberfest.circleci.com, click on the Submit My PRs button, and then it'll bring you to a Google form where you can fill out your PRs, and we'll send you the t-shirt probably at the end of November, I'm assuming, is more than likely when that will happen. I'll give you the link to our Discuss post. And Google thinks I was talking to it. There we go. Perfect. And I will end us on that note. Thank you for joining, everyone. I don't think we have any final questions. It looks like we're all set. And with that, happy hacking. Have a great Hacktober.